in the 19th century all the way through today to give us an idea of how we got to this place that we are today. All right. So a little bit about our history. The Choctaw Nation, we are known as one of the 5 civilized tribes, and we are ancestral to Mississippi and the western portions of Alabama. And like many other southeastern tribes, we are members of the Muskogean language family. Out of the 5 tribes, the only tribe that is not a member of this language family is the Cherokee, and they are more closely related to the Iroquois Confederacy and that language family. And we are actually one of the largest tribes that originated in the southeast United States. And you can kind of see a little bit of our traditional area, our traditional homelands here in relation to the other tribes in the southeast, and then the names that we would have called them by. Okay. And so we were part of a mound building society. Our creation story actually speaks of our emergence from our homelands and the building of Naniwaya, our sacred mound. And at the top there, you will see a picture of Naniwaya Cave. And this is where one of our creation stories says that we emerged. God brought us out from the clay of the cave and into the light to dry. And then at the bottom, you will see that the mound that we erected in order to reverence God for giving us the land there in Mississippi, and this was our sacred mound of Naniwaya, and it still stands in Winston County, Mississippi. It's actually protected. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and you can still visit that. I had the privilege of being able to visit last summer, and it was a really cool experience. You definitely feel like you're going home when you stand on that land. And so we can go to the next slide. So Choctaws lived in villages which could span up to 2 miles in radius. So we had very large spread out villages. They were located within one of 3 political districts of the Choctaw Nation. And at the bottom here, you'll actually see how those are divided. We had the Oklafalaya, the Ayapat Okla, and the Oklahanali. Now, unlike a lot of people are starting, or what I've heard people starting to say, is that they are looking at these as being your clan, but this is not your clan system. This was just your political district that your village was located in, was one of these 3. And Choctaws were actually horticulturalists, and we took part in supplemental hunting. And we grew things like traditional Choctaw squash, or sweet potato squash, corn. We have several different varieties of corn, and other plants like lamb's quarter and different things that you can find. And we're actually doing heritage seeds to start growing these types of vegetables and edible plants once again. In fact, the sweet potato squash we grow up at Tuskahoma at the Capitol, and we're having a little bit of difficulty getting the Choctaw corn started. Unfortunately, because they are a heritage seed, if there's anyone near you that's growing the corn that we have today, it's probably going to crossbreed, and then you're not going to have your true Choctaw corn. So that's kind of a thing that we're working on, but it might take a little time to find the space needed to grow it. So we can go ahead and go. All right, so Choctaws belong to a matriarchal society. We were centered around the women. Your kinship was always based on your mother's clan, your moiety, and your clan. This actually stands in stark opposition to what Europeans did at this time, when they were more patriarchal and it came through your father's side. The boys were always raised by their mother's uncle. The way that I've heard it explained was, you might have known who your father was, but he had really no bearing on your upbringing at all. And women were given very high status and seen as givers of life, while men were seen as the takers of life. And obviously that's because women, we have the ability to give birth, whereas men, because of war and different things, they will end up taking life in some instances. And here you can see our photos we have of some Choctaw women. In the middle there, that is a drawing that our artist Ruby Bolding drew of what a Choctaw woman would have looked like in the 1700s, and you can see that she would have probably had the tattoos on the face, and the cape that she's wearing there would have been made out of, I believe, probably turkey feathers, and she has her moccasins and her skirt that would have been made out of plant fibers, most probably. And so Choctaw women, we were the foundation of the community. We were the property owners, we were the agricultural producers, and we took care of the domestic activities like pottery, basket making, cooking, and then making the clothing and raising children. So we can go to our next slide. All right, and our Choctaw men, we typically relied on them to be the hunters, protectors of the community. They were also our stickball players, which a lot of people chuckle when I say that because they think, oh, they got to have fun and play games all the time, but that's actually not what it was. Stickball is the little brother of war. It is a very violent sport at times, and at this point in time, this is how Choctaws settled disputes. It was by playing stickball rather than fighting each other with weapons. And you know, today we've been lucky enough to hold on to that, and we are still playing stickball. The men would have interacted with the other groups, they would have done the heaviest work, and they also would have served as the historians or the orators for the tribe. And so after European contact, Choctaws began relying more heavily on European-made goods. Our first European contact would have been with DeSoto in the 1540s. And unfortunately, we gained a reliance on these European-made goods, which ended up leading to debt. Choctaws did take part in the deer hide trade in the Southeast. And so the way that typically worked was when you cannot produce the number of hides for the amount of goods that you've taken, suddenly you've racked up some debt. And so this actually opened the door for treaties to be made starting in the 1700s, and that way you could pay off your debt by giving a land cession. And here in the photo, you're actually going to see the land that the Choctaws owned in the Southeast. This was our traditional homelands. All of this was given up through the treaties that you see listed here. And because of the treaties that we made for the lands in the Southeast, we gained the lands in Arkansas and Oklahoma. And eventually all of that is going to be ceded through additional treaties, and we're going to end up with just our 10.5 counties today. And so, as I was saying, we began entering into treaties with the United States that consisted of land cessions in order to pay debts. Citizens of Mississippi and Alabama were also pushing for the removal of the Choctaws so that they could obtain these fertile agricultural lands that the Choctaws possessed. And so this began to shape the U.S. Indian policy in the 1800s, and it would eventually lead to the policy of removal for all the tribes to be removed from the southeastern United States into Indian territory. And in my slide here, you're actually going to see pictures of some of our main players in Indian removal for the Choctaw people. We have Chief Moshlatubbee, Pushmataha, and President Andrew Jackson. Now, one thing that's really important to remember in the story of the Choctaws and our removal is Choctaws were always strong allies of the United States. Chief Pushmataha was made Lieutenant Colonel under Andrew Jackson, and our Choctaw troops alongside Pushmataha fought in the War of 1812. And because of Pushmataha and his warriors, we actually were able to help defeat the British at the Battle of New Orleans. And the loyalty and the friendship of the Choctaws, while it was always strong, it wasn't enough to stop Andrew Jackson and his policy of removal. I have actually read certain accounts where, Andrew Jackson spoke very highly of Pushmataha, but in reality, he could never be anything more than just a noble Indian. So, regardless of the ally friendship that we had with the United States, we were still the first tribe that Andrew Jackson sent his commissioners to remove from the Southeast. All right. Technical difficulties. Oh, wait, we can go back one more. Sorry. Okay. So, in 1820, after a lot of rumors of removal that were going around among the tribes in the Southeast, the commissioners were sent to negotiate the Treaty of Don't Stand. And it was very stressful conditions that this treaty was signed under. There was bribery and exaggerations. There were a lot of threats of, you know, we're going to let the settlers come in and we're going to let them just take your land and you're not going to have our protection anymore. You're going to have a loss of this friendship that we've built if you don't sign this treaty. And so because of this, the treaty was eventually signed, and in return, the Choctaws were promised goods and supplies, some education for their children. They were promised that they would be able to establish a police force or their light horsemen. And after that promise is made, there's still a lot of turmoil in the Southeast at this time. Settlers are still wanting to take Choctaw lands. In fact, there are accounts of white settlers coming in and just burning Choctaw homes, burning villages, burning the agricultural fields, trying to push the Choctaws out any way that they could. And so in 1830, the commissioners were once again sent Dancing Rabbit Creek. And this was also after the official policy of Indian removal had been passed by Congress on May 28th of 1830. And so in the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, this was going to be pretty much the final nail in the coffin as far as having to leave our homelands behind. Choctaw lands were ceded in exchange for a new home in Indian Territory, which would become Oklahoma, which is a Choctaw word which means red people. And this treaty was signed under threats that the United States would their lands and they would be destroyed by the U.S. military. And they would be forced to ship and the protection of the United States if they signed this treaty. However, there was Article 14 of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek that said that if Choctaws wished to remain in Mississippi, they would be allowed to do so, but only as United States citizens. They would no longer have the status of tribal members as a tribal sovereign nation. And so there were actually quite a few Choctaws who opted to stay in Mississippi. And in order to do this, they were supposed to go to the Indian Commissioner and they were supposed to sign up and let them know that they wanted to stay. Unfortunately, the Indian agent and the commissioners there were corrupt, and most of the names never made it to the list. They magically disappeared. So those people were forced to Oklahoma on the trail anyway. The few that did get to remain, however, became the Mississippi Band of Choctaws that we still have on the reservation today. Okay. So Choctaws were to be removed during the three initial waves of removal in 1831, 1832, and 1833. They were promised transportation for the trip, supplies like blankets and food and anything that they needed. However, this did not come to fruition. And it was not easy being removed in the middle of the worst blizzard in history in the southeastern United States in 1831. In fact, Choctaws were forced to camp outside of Memphis for 2 weeks, waiting for the steamboats to be able to get up the river without proper clothing or food or shelter. And unfortunately, many of them died before they even began their journey. So the Trail of Tears is actually a phrase that was coined by a Choctaw chief. There was a reporter from the Arkansas Gazette that was standing there, and he's watching these Choctaw people as they're being forced along the trail. And as they were coming off one of the steamboats, he stopped this chief and he asked him what was this experience like for him. And he replied, "It's a trail of tears and death." And so that's actually where that phrase comes from, for the Trail of Tears. We had a 25% death rate of our people. We are estimating probably somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people died on the Trail of Tears. Our clan system was destroyed. Families were displaced. There was a loss of knowledge because of the families being displaced, and there was a religious or spiritual disruption because we were being taken away from this land that we had lived in for all these years. You know, one of the best ways that I can describe this is, imagine that someone comes to your house and says you're going to pack everything you have in one bag and you can't take anything else with you, and you're never coming back here ever again. You know, this is what our ancestors faced. This is what they went through. And so you're being torn away from the land, and people were said to have walked around and they were touching the dirt. They were taking handfuls of the dirt. They were touching the leaves. They were crying. They were saying goodbye to this land that they had known their entire life. And because you are so connected with the land that you came from. For a tribe whose creation story even says that we came from this land, you know, that's obviously going to cause a lot of anguish spiritually and mentally. And, you know, you weren't necessarily guaranteed to be removed with your family. You were broken up, you were put into separate little groups. You didn't know if you were ever going to see them again in some situations. And so that's a part of the reason why we were not able to maintain our clan system or to maintain a lot of the knowledge that we once had. So that was just a quick overview. We ran through that, time traveled through that pretty fast. But now we're going to move into post-1830. And this is going to be our life in Oklahoma. Now, I had originally shown you guys a picture that had showed that the Choctaws, because a treaty, had at one time been promised basically all the land in southern Oklahoma. Well, unfortunately, because of additional treaties, that land is taken away and we get left with this 10.5 counties that we still have today. Now, it was not an easy task to rebuild and to reclaim what we once had once we arrived in Oklahoma. We were placed upon lands that actually belonged to other tribes. And of course, when the federal government took our land, they didn't bother to tell the other tribes, oh yeah, we're pushing you off yours too. So the lands that we were actually put on were ancestral to the Caddo and the Wichita, and the Comanches had started using this area of the southern plains all the way down into Texas and sometimes Mexico in order to have hunting grounds. And so we had to deal with a lot of raids by the Comanches. During this time, there was a lot of resentment that we were there. Choctaw houses or fields could be burned, cattle could be stolen, just different things happening. And it wasn't something that was our fault. It was just something that we were left to deal with. We did have the United States Army here. They were actually stationed at Fort Washita during this time in order to keep the peace as best they could among the tribes. There were also outbreaks of illness and continued hardships when you're trying to rebuild yourself, but luckily we were actually able to bounce back very well from this. So we can go to the next slide. So 1834 to 1860, Choctaw saw an increase in prosperity here in Oklahoma. Here you'll actually see a photo of our House of Representatives for our Choctaw Council, or today we'll just know it as our Council House, that was up at Tushkahoma by Lake Naniwaya. And we began to establish our economy again through cattle ranching and cotton plantations, and also trading our goods with our neighbors here in Oklahoma. And we continued to practice our culture by continuing to play stickball, stomp dancing, making traditional pottery and other traditional arts. Our Constitution, our light horsemen, we built missions, and a lot of the missionaries that were in Mississippi with us actually traveled to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and so they were able to reestablish the missions and boarding schools that we had there. So in 1855, the Choctaws signed a treaty with the Chickasaws, which ceded more Choctaw land. Up until this time, the Chickasaws had actually been given representation in the Choctaw government. They were actually the last tribe to be removed, and so when they came to Oklahoma, you know, they actually put us in the same land base. And today you'll even see that there are Chickasaws who have allotment in Choctaw Nation, and there are Choctaws that have allotments in Chickasaw Nation. But it actually at one time was all Choctaw Nation. So in 1855, you know, the Chickasaws decided that they weren't being given enough voice in the Choctaw government, and so they asked to be able to establish their own. And so that is where you get that dividing line between the Choctaws and Chickasaws, was this 1855 treaty. Okay. And then, of course, during this time, we enter into the American Civil War. Unfortunately, tribes were not able to escape the perils of war, just like everybody else. So Choctaws, like the other tribes who were removed to Oklahoma, we ended up joining the conflict. We already had ties to the South, and so we allied with the Confederacy during this time. And by the end of the war, a third of the tribe was destitute. There were men out fighting, and so there was no one to take care of the cattle, to take care of the crops. And outlaws and renegades came through and burned and pillaged the Choctaw towns and settlements that they had worked so hard to build. And then you just had that constant stress of being in a war zone, of being there with military presence around you. And then at the end of the war, toward the end, we get the Treaty of 1866, where we were required to cede more lands. Now, remember, Doak Stand said no more land cessions, but here we are in 1866, still having to cede lands to the government. This time, this land was used for railroads to be allowed to cross Choctaw lands. You had a loss of a lot of sovereign rights with this treaty, because prior to this time, anytime you had U.S. Marshals or any government official that wanted to enter Choctaw territory, they had to ask permission from our government first. But according to the 1866 treaty, they no longer had to do that. They could enter and go as freely as they liked. And so that was a blow to our sovereignty as a tribal government. And so they gave us a small window of time to kind of rebuild and to resettle. And then tribes are hit with the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act of 1877. Now, I know the last time that we did a presentation, which was last month, a lot of people were interested in the Dawes Act and tribal allotments and the roles and how they were created. And so this is where we're going to get into this and talk about it a little more in depth. So Henry L. Dawes, who was the author of the Dawes Act, was a senator from Massachusetts. And like many other people in the East, he was a sympathetic Indian supporter. And he felt that we needed to help the poor Indians. And the best way to do that was to basically assimilate us. And this is the time period where you're going to see boarding schools pop up with the motto of "Kill the Indian, save the man" type of mentality. And the best thing that you could do for an Indian, according to the people back east and in the government, was to assimilate them into white society. So in order to force this assimilation, the communal lives of Indian people would have to be destroyed. So Indian people could then live the life of white farmers, and this would solve all their issues and all their poverty, because they would be able to provide for themselves and their families. Make them a farmer, they can sell their goods, they can have food to eat, they will have no more problems. But one thing that they didn't take into account is not all of these tribes were on the best land for farming. So the Dawes Act, which was passed in 1877, broke tribal lands into individual allotments. Now, when the allotment process was finished, all that surplus land is going to be opened up for others to come in and purchase. So that's when we start seeing settlers moving into Indian territory. And initially, the Choctaw Nation, like the other tribes of the 5 tribes, were excluded from this act. So this is predominantly when you're going to see reservations in this 1877 time period that are going to be broken up. But in Indian territory, initially, we were able to escape it. So go to the next slide. So now we're going to talk some about the major laws and policies of the late 19th and 20th century. So we can move on. So, like I said, we were initially excluded from the first wave of allotments. However, in 1893, the Dawes Commission was created. And they decided that, well, we need to go and we need to do allotments in Oklahoma. So, while the Choctaw Nation was originally excluded, they were not able to escape it. And in 1893, the Dawes Commission was formed and sent to issue allotments. And in order to receive allotments, tribal members were required to enroll with the Dawes Commission. And they were given roll numbers and then issued their allotment lands. And this is where you see the Dawes rolls come into play. This is the list, this is the rolls that we use for enrollment today. And then once everyone had received their land, or everyone that was willing to sign up, the surplus land was open for settlement. And this is where we see the land run coming into play later on in Oklahoma. And in 1898, the Dawes Act was enacted. It abolished tribal governments, and the tribal members were then made citizens of the United States. An official citizenship statute was later passed in 1924 for those that had not signed up on the rolls. Prior to this, some of the Choctaws had already become citizens. So for those that initially weren't, they were put on the Dawes rolls, and the 1898 Dawes Act comes along, makes them citizens. And those that were not on the rolls, then you're going to see in 1924 all tribes across the board are going to be made citizens of the United States. The very interesting thing about the Dawes Act was it was actually authored by a gentleman from Kansas or Nebraska, and he was actually mixed blood Indian. So he was actually the author of abolishing tribal governments during this time period. Okay, we can go to the next one. So we see in this time period from the late 1800s up to the 1920s, we've seen allotments happen, we've seen tribal governments abolished, and we've seen Oklahoma become a state in 1907. Now, in 1928, the Merriam Report was released to Congress. Now, the purpose of the Merriam Report was basically to survey the lives of tribal people across the United States and to see if allotments had worked, if tribes were suddenly taken out of being destitute, being poverty-stricken, and living elevated lives. So, these surveys, unfortunately, found that tribes were still in destitute conditions, and sometimes worse conditions than they were before allotments. And in 1934, under President Roosevelt, or FDR, as most of us learn about in school, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed. The Indian Reorganization Act was also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, or the Indian New Deal. So the IRA was intended to undo the policy of allotment and it negate the effects of assimilation. And it ended the practice of allotment. It placed lands into trust indefinitely, so that's where we come with our trust lands. It also authorized tribal ownership and surplus lands which had not been previously purchased after allotment to go back into tribal hands. So we actually did gain some land back under the IRA. And it encouraged tribes to live their traditional lifestyles again. It was supposed to improve the lives of Indian people by restoring many tribal rights to land, and it allowed us to write our own constitutions that were then required to be ratified by Congress. So they're giving you back a little bit of sovereignty, but they're still holding on to a little bit of control. And this can go back to what you will find in the Marshall Trilogy during the time of removal, when Chief Justice Marshall described us as domestic dependent nations like a ward to their guardian. So this is kind of where you can see a little bit of that language from removal period coming back to haunt us again. Okay. So after we were given back some of our sovereign rights, and we were able to reestablish a little bit of our governments, in 1953, the federal government decided it was time to get out of the Indian business. They had done all they were going to do, and so it was time for tribes to be terminated and live like the rest of America. So the idea behind termination was to free tribes from federal government oversight, which could improve the lives of tribal members. Now, termination was used to put an end to tribal sovereignty and governments. And the tribal members were then viewed as only citizens of the United States and were subject to the same laws as other U.S. citizens. And during this time, the federal government also began encouraging the relocation of tribal members. During the 50s and 60s, you could go and find flyers posted around promising a better life in California or New York or Minneapolis or really large urban areas. And it was this policy of relocation was used to move the tribal members to these urban areas so they could be provided with more opportunities for employment and a better quality of life. And so this is where we get a lot of Choctaws in California, which explains why we have our gathering out there every year, because a lot of them did relocate, and some of them actually probably started relocating with everyone else back during the Dust Bowl. So, you know, we have a lot of Native people in large urban areas because of this program. And so by the 1960s and early 70s, it became another failure with termination. The United States had tried all of these different policies to improve the lives of Indian people. Nothing had worked. So President Nixon actually called for Congress to overturn their policy of termination and uphold the trust responsibilities that the United States held toward tribes through treaty. Now, President Nixon also felt that tribes should be allowed to manage their own affairs as sovereign nations or with limited government oversight. And so in 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And this act is what paved the way for tribal governments that exist today. And you have to remember that during this time period in the late 60s and early 70s, you have a lot of civil rights activism going on. You have the American Indian Movement, or AIM, that starts becoming very active. And they were calling for the United States, for the government to uphold these policy rights, to uphold these treaties that the United States had made. And at this time, they began understanding that they did have rights and they had the ability to hire lawyers to ask them to explain these treaties and what they had. And so this kind of feeds into what you see with President Nixon and the Indian Self-Determination Act in '75. All right, so we've time traveled a little bit more, so we're going to go to the Choctaw Nation today. So, reestablishing our government. The Choctaw Nation passed their constitution, which is the constitution that we're using now, in 1983. And our government was established with three governing bodies. We have our legislative or tribal council, our executive, which is our chief and assistant chief, and judicial, which are our tribal judges. Our legislative and executive officials are elected similar to that of the United States government. We still maintain a traditional political foundation while maintaining our sovereign tribal rights. And this includes sustaining our economy, resource management, preservation of culture, and our tribal services. And today, after all the hardships that the Choctaw Nation has faced, whether it was through removal or any of the terrible policies that plagued us, we are still the third largest tribe in the United States. We're located in the 10.5 counties of southeast Oklahoma. We are a functioning tribal government that provides services to tribal members, including the areas of health, social services, culture, employment, and education. We're involved in tribal economic development in the areas of gaming, travel plazas, manufacturing like Choctaw Defense. We're starting to get involved in tourism, retail with Chili's franchises, Texoma Print, Choctaw Merchandise, just to name a few. And then we also have our cattle and buffalo ranching. And we are sustaining ourselves and we are sustaining our people while still holding on to our culture and our traditional foundations. And we're seeing a cultural reawakening today. We've seen a surge in the interest of Choctaw culture by our tribal members and then also those outside of the tribe that are just curious. We maintain a culture that is alive and active. Our Historic Preservation Department and Cultural Services Department provide classes and demonstrations on activities like basketry, pottery, traditional weapons like bow making, flint knapping. We do traditional hide tanning. For a while we were doing the moccasin making classes, but those are temporary on hold while we look for new hides. And then we also teach beading and traditional games like stickball. And recently, over the past 6 months, we started demonstrating a choppy, which is a traditional game that's actually older than stickball. So I kind of sped through that, but like I said, we had a lot of time traveling to do. Here you'll see just a little slideshow that I put together of kind of our cultural reawakening and what we're seeing. There you can see David Batten's lovely face smiling at you, playing a choppy. You can see Dr. Thompson there making pottery at Labor Day, and then this is a photo of a pottery firing, and then some of the other activities that we've had at Labor Day festivities. And I'll open it up for questions. Anybody have a question for me? Because we've still got quite a bit of time. I can cover something more in depth or whatever you guys need.
I have a question on the allotments. How did they determine where and how much the members would get?
The Allotment Act actually set forth the amount of, I believe it was 180 acres for each head of household. And one of the things about allotments was breaking up this communal tribal ownership idea of land. And so they were breaking you up from your family, basically. So they're separating you. You didn't really know where you were going to end up. The Dawes Commission, everything was set up on a grid. So like if you look at a GLO map or one of the older maps, you'll actually see that allotments are set on grids. So you have 180 here, 180 here, 180 here, and so then they're just going to assign you. I don't know if it was just, I haven't researched it enough to know if it was just luck of the draw, if it was just random where they put you, but I do know one of the main reasons for the allotments was to break you apart. So chances are you may, if you were lucky enough to be by your family, it probably wasn't going to be a close contact type of situation. Now, another thing that you have to remember about allotments is we had a lot of tribal members that may not have actually signed up for these allotments. I know me personally, my mother's family did not. I was actually able to locate their Dawes applications. They're in, you can actually go to the National Archives website and you can look at Dawes applications. My family on my mother's side, their applications say they were dismissed. They refused to go on the rolls. So they had to go before the Dawes Commission and say that they were relinquishing all their ties to the tribe. And so you can actually have a situation where you can find those court documents that will actually list all of the people that said, you know, they are hereby no longer Choctaw by blood, and then there's a list of their names. And the reason for doing that is, you know, during this time period, it was dangerous to be Indian. There was a lot of racism, and some tribes like the Osage, you actually had murder happening, you know, people marrying into the families and then murdering the tribal members so they could inherit the land. I mean, these are all things that were going on here in Oklahoma, not just with Choctaws, but with all tribes. So it could be dangerous to be Indian at this time. It wasn't something that people were proud of in the early 1900s. It was something that was really looked down upon. So everyone had their various reasons for not enrolling. Another thing that you have to remember too is blood quantum comes into play. And this is where they start writing down how much Choctaw they thought you were. Blood quantum is not right. It's used as a discriminatory tool to gauge how white you are. How do you look at someone based on the color of their skin and say you're full blood, you're a quarter, you're half? It's not an exact science. You know, as we know, there is no such thing as Choctaw blood. That's not a blood type. But this is where you see blood quantum come into play, and so this is what we're using today. So like today, when you get your tribal membership cards and it says that you are, you know, whatever degree Choctaw by blood, it comes from these rolls. And so another issue that the Dawes rolls presented for the tribes was they were taking the sovereign right from the tribe of being able to establish their own tribal membership. And they were enforcing their rules and their laws to determine who was going to be a member of that tribe. You know, if you adopted someone in and they had been Choctaw for years, Dawes Commission may not have seen it that way. So there were people that culturally may have been Choctaw, but we're no longer Choctaw in the eyes of the federal government. So basically what allotments did was it made you legitimate in the eyes of the federal government. And it was a way of control. It was a way of diminishing sovereignty during that time. Because as I'd mentioned, after the allotment and the Dawes Commission actually comes to Oklahoma, that's when tribal governments are abolished shortly after it's completed. And so it's, for many years, we've been fighting to maintain our sovereignty. And it's been this ebb and flow of what is going to be taken away and when is it going to be given back. And so it's something that it's important to understand how all of this comes into play, how all of these laws have built upon each other in order to maintain what we have today. So, I mean, does that kind of answer your question, or?
Because my great-great-grandfather was given the 180,
Mm-hmm.
but I was just wondering, he was from LaFleur, so I was just wondering if they just picked out a piece of land, and if you were living on that land or whatever, you had to be moved off, so this person would now be given that land, or towns, or settlements, or whatever.
You know, I know that my great-grandmother was born around Caney on my dad's side, but she ended up receiving her allotments outside of Medill.
Same here.
So, I mean,
My family come from Mississippi, living in Philadelphia, and they came to Kiowa, Oklahoma. Then from there, they waited around, and then they were accepted through, through the interpretation, and all that was done in Meridian, or some was done wherever.